A lone man spotted an impossible shape moving through the storm toward him. A dying mother lion, her cubs trembling against her frozen body, staggered through a brutal Montana blizzard, straight toward the cabin of a man who had lost everything. When she collapsed at his doorstep, he faced an impossible choice. What happened next would bind their lives together in a way no one could ever believe. The storm had swallowed the mountains long before dusk, burying the ridgelines in a wall of white so dense it smudged the horizon into nothing. The wind roared like an ancient beast, twisting through the pines and ripping at the frozen earth. In that churning wilderness, a lone figure pushed forward, a lioness, her golden coat muted beneath layers of frost. Mara moved as though each step cost her pieces of her own life. Her muscles trembled beneath the weight of exhaustion, and her breath came out in thin, broken clouds that vanished instantly in the cold. Pressed tightly against her belly were her two cubs, their small bodies shaking uncontrollably. Their paws scraped weakly at the snow as they tried to keep pace, but their strength had nearly faded. Their whimpers were faint, whisked away by the relentless wind before they could reach another living ear. Mara tightened her flank around them, trying to shield them from the cold that burned like fire. The blizzard was merciless, and she knew, somewhere deep inside, that the storm did not care who lived or died. It simply consumed. Her vision blurred as ice stung her eyes. The world around her flickered in and out, a shifting mix of shadows and white. Every few steps she faltered, her body dropping lower before she forced herself upright again. She moved not for herself anymore, but for the tiny heartbeats pressed against her ribs. If she fell now, they would freeze within minutes. Her paws sank deep into the drifts, dragging as though chained by the storm itself. The weight of the cubs, usually a comfort, now threatened to pull her under. Night crept across the mountain. Though the storm's fury made it hard to tell, the temperature plummeted further, and the air thinned into a biting cold that clawed at Mara's lungs. Her whiskers had turned brittle with frost. Her tail dragged behind her like a forgotten rope. She blinked through the snow, her instincts reaching desperately for any sign of shelter, any break in the hostile white around her. But the blizzard reduced everything to a blur, stripping away scent, sound, and direction. The cubs whimpered again, softer this time. Their tiny paws slipped on the ice. One stumbled and nearly fell completely before Mara nudged him back beneath her belly with a trembling sweep of her hind leg. She felt the sound the cub made more than she heard it. A small vibration, weak and fading. Panic clawed through her fatigue. She lowered herself just enough to curl her body tighter around them, blocking the worst of the wind. Her ribs heaved, her heart pounding against the cage of her chest. The storm shrieked, untamed and indifferent. Mara pushed forward anyway, driven by something older than fear. Her paws thudded clumsily through the snow, each landing jarring through her body like a shock. At times she slipped on patches of invisible ice, her body slamming into the drift before she forced herself up again. For a brief moment, the snow eased just enough for her to see a faint line of dark trees. She lifted her head, hope flickering like a dying spark. If she could reach them, the cubs might live a little longer, shielded by branches instead of the open sky. But the storm surged again, louder and harsher, swallowing the trees in white. The ground rose beneath her unexpectedly, and she stumbled forward, nearly collapsing on top of the cubs. She caught herself just in time, legs splaying awkwardly before she found balance. Her breath rasped through her throat. She felt warmth leaking from her strength, draining into the icy ground with every step she took. The cubs' movements grew slower. Mara felt their shivers weaken, no longer sharp, but sluggish and irregular. Fear pierced through her exhaustion with a brutal clarity. She leaned down and nudged them firmly, urging them to stay awake, to cling to her warmth. Her body gave off little heat now, but she offered everything she had left. She pressed them deeper under her chest fur, shielding them with her failing strength. Somewhere far ahead, shielded by the storm's wrath, a faint glow flickered behind a veil of falling snow, a light, small and warm, fighting the darkness. Mara blinked hard, her vision wavering. Was it real? She strained her eyes, trying to separate the dim glow from the storm's tricks. There it was again, a soft pulse of amber light. A cabin. A human structure. She had never approached such a thing before, but instinct no longer cared about borders or danger. Her cubs needed warmth. Now. She forced her body forward, each step sending pain lancing through her limbs. The snow clung to her fur, weighing her down, pulling her toward the earth below. Her paws shook violently. The light grew closer, steadier. She could feel warmth trying to reach her through the cold, as though calling her home. She staggered, regained balance, then trudged on with the final traces of her will. At last, the cabin's outline materialized from the storm, its windows glowing with the faint promise of life. Mara felt her strength slip away all at once, her legs buckling beneath her. She collapsed in the snow only a few feet from the door, her body half curled around her cubs. Her breath rattled as she pressed them closer to her chest, giving them the last of her warmth. Her eyelids fluttered, heavy and slow. The storm howled above her, swirling around the lonely cabin in the mountains. The lioness lay still except for the faint, ragged movement of her chest. Her cubs whimpered weakly beneath her, their tiny bodies trembling with the fading spark of life. And as the blizzard raged on, the light in the window flickered, hinting that someone inside might yet see them, might step into the storm before it was too late. She could only hope. Inside the small, weather-beaten cabin, Ethan Walker sat hunched forward in an old wooden chair, staring into the fire as if it held all the answers he'd been searching for since the day the mountains took his son. The flames crackled softly, casting warm amber light across the cramped room, dancing over shelves filled with worn gear, faded photos, and maps scarred by creases. Ethan's hands rested loosely around a mug of untouched coffee gone cold an hour ago. He wasn't really drinking it. He just needed something to hold on to. The storm outside battered the cabin with the force of 1,000 ghosts. The wind howled against the windows, rattling the glass in its frame and slipping through the cracks around the sill. Snow piled high against the door, and each gust sent another wave of white whipping across the yard. Ethan had lived through dozens of winters in these mountains, but this one felt personal, like the storm itself remembered him. His gaze drifted to a small photograph stuck into the frame of the cabin window, a boy with a crooked smile and curious eyes. Liam, his son. The memory hit like a dull ache beneath his ribs. He exhaled slowly, rubbing a thumb along the edge of the mug. Living alone out here wasn't a choice anymore. It was the only place where the world stayed quiet enough for him to breathe. The nearest town was an hour away on a good day, and days like that were rare. The isolation had become its own kind of refuge, a place where grief settled into something he could carry without collapsing under the weight of it. He had grown used to the stillness, the predictable rhythm of cold mornings and silent nights. Nothing ever changed. Until now. A flicker of movement caught his attention, reflected faintly in the lower corner of the frosted window pane. At first he thought it was just the storm, snow shifting, branches thrashing. He leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing slightly. Another flicker, a shape, a color that didn't quite belong to the storm. Ethan straightened slowly, placing the mug on the table beside him. His pulse quickened, not from fear, but from instinct, the kind that had kept him alive during years of mountain rescues. He stood and stepped closer to the window, brushing aside the thin layer of frost with the back of his hand. His breath hitched. There, barely visible through the curtain of snow, was a large shape lumbering through the yard. The wind bent the world into waves of white, but between them he could see something golden, moving with a staggering, uneven gait. It wasn't a deer. It wasn't an elk. It was bigger. He squinted, leaning in until his forehead nearly touched the cold glass. The shape struggled forward, its outline sharpening as the gusts shifted. Then he saw it clearly. Massive shoulders, a heavy frame, fur weighted down by ice. A lioness. Ethan froze where he stood. There hadn't been confirmed sightings of lions this far north in years, especially not in a storm like this. His mind scrambled to make sense of it, but the scene only grew more startling. Beneath her, pressed against her belly, were two tiny cubs, their small bodies trembling violently. "What in the world?" The words left him in a whisper, swallowed by the crackle of the fire. He watched as the lioness forced herself another step forward, then another, her body swaying as if she were balancing on the edge of collapse. Snow clung to her fur, hiding the golden sheen beneath a layer of white. Her head dipped low, and at one moment she stumbled, nearly falling, before dragging herself upright again. Every instinct in Ethan's body screamed danger. Predators were unpredictable, especially in desperation. But another instinct pushed against it, the one that had driven him into the mountains for years, the instinct to help, to respond when something needed saving. His breath fogged the glass as he leaned closer. The lioness paused just a few yards from his door, her flank rising and falling in shallow, ragged breaths. Her cubs whimpered weakly, a sound so faint he almost imagined it. Ethan stepped back from the window, swallowing hard. His pulse thumped heavily in his ears. This wasn't just unusual, it was impossible. Why would a wild animal come this close to a human dwelling? Why would it risk everything to approach a cabin in a deadly storm? The fevered thought passed through him like a shiver. Animals didn't move toward danger unless something worse was behind them. Lightning cracked across the sky, followed by a deep rumble. The storm intensified, pounding the cabin walls like fists. Ethan turned toward the door, torn between his training and his fear. He had treated wounded wildlife before, though never anything so large and so lethal. The logical part of him knew that opening the door for a lioness, one with cubs, was inviting death. But the sight of her, the way she dragged herself through the snow, the way those cubs clung to her, he felt something within him shift. Something that had been buried under months of grief stirred like a faint heartbeat. He walked toward the door slowly, his boots thudding softly on the wooden floor. He paused with his hand on the metal latch. The cold seeped through the door, chilling his fingers even through the thick gloves he wore. He pressed his ear against the wood. He could hear nothing but the storm. No growl, no scratch, no sound of attack waiting on the other side. He lifted his head and stared at the door as though it had suddenly become a gate between two worlds. He didn't open it, not yet. Fear held his hand in place. Instead, he stepped back to the window and watched again. He saw Mara falter, her legs folding beneath her. She dropped to the snow with a heavy thud, snow rising around her in a small plume. The cubs scrambled weakly beneath her chest. She didn't move. She didn't lift her head. Slowly, shakily, she nudged the cubs forward with the last remnants of her strength. Ethan's chest tightened. This wasn't the posture of a predator. It was the posture of a mother who knew she was losing her fight. He exhaled, shaky and uneven, fogging the window once more. Something twisted inside him, a knot of fear, grief, and responsibility merging into one emotion he knew too well, because he remembered another winter, another storm, another life slipping away just out of reach. If someone had been close enough to save his boy that night, if someone had opened a door, stepped into the cold, taken a chance. Ethan blinked hard, his breath trembling. He turned away from the window, pacing once toward the fireplace and back again. The The firelight caught the edge of the photo of Liam, and his chest clenched. Saving these cubs wouldn't change what happened. But doing nothing, watching a mother collapse with her young on his doorstep, felt like betrayal to everything he once stood for. He stopped at the door again, the latch cold beneath his finger. The storm screamed outside, and the wind rattled the walls. He could feel the danger breathing on the other side, but the silence inside the cabin was louder, an echo of all the quiet moments he wished he could rewrite. Ethan inhaled deeply, bracing himself. Then he unlatched the door. The wind tore it open instantly, blasting the room with freezing air, swirling snow across the floorboards. Ethan squinted into the blinding white, searching for the figures he had seen through the window, and there they were. 3 forms huddled together in the snow, barely moving. He stepped out into the storm. The cold hit him like a wall, slicing through his coat and burning his face, but he pushed forward with one hand shielding his eyes. He trudged through the thick drifts until he reached the lioness lying collapsed in the powder, her body curled around her cubs as if she could somehow keep the storm from taking them. But she was losing that battle. Her breathing was shallow and uneven, each exhale almost lost in the roar of the wind. Ethan knelt beside them, snow soaking into his jeans. The cubs stirred weakly beneath their mother's chest, giving off faint, trembling cries. They were so small, so fragile, that he could feel the thinness of their lives in the air around them. The lioness lifted her head just an inch, her eyes barely open. Those eyes, clouded by exhaustion, found Ethan through the snow. There was no threat in them, no spark of aggression. Only a desperate kind of pleading, as if she recognized that whatever happened next depended on him alone. She nudged her cubs with the tip of her muzzle, trying to push them toward him. The motion was clumsy, unsteady, but unmistakable. Ethan swallowed hard, breath shaking. "Easy, easy, girl," he murmured, though he knew she couldn't understand the words. His voice was carried away instantly by the wind. Still, something in her gaze shifted, softened. Snow piled against her back, clinging to her frozen fur. Ethan brushed some of it away, his gloved hand trembling as he touched the coarse, ice-hardened coat. She didn't flinch. She didn't have the strength to. Her body sagged heavily into the snow. He reached toward the cubs first. Their tiny bodies fit almost entirely into his palms, their fur stiff with frost. One let out a faint cry as he lifted it, a sound so thin it nearly broke him. He tucked the cub inside his coat, against his chest where his body heat might keep it alive. Then he reached for the second one, placing it gently beside the first. The warmth of his body made them stir, stretching weakly as though trying to burrow deeper into safety. Ethan held them close, closing his coat around them. They were weightless, barely more than breath. Then he looked down at the lioness. Mara lay nearly motionless, her sides rising and falling in slow, uneven waves. Snow gathered along her spine, piling around her paws. Ethan knew a full-grown lioness could be dangerous beyond measure, even in a weakened state. But there was no mistaking it. She wasn't trying to hurt him. She was trying to get him to take her cubs. She had used the last of her strength to push them toward the only warmth she could find, the only shelter in miles of frozen wilderness. "Come on," he whispered, glancing toward the cabin. It was only a short distance away, but the storm made every step feel like wading through quicksand. He looked back at Mara. Her eyes fluttered, drifting open and closed as if she were teetering on the edge of unconsciousness. "We're going inside," he said, though he wasn't sure if he was talking to her or convincing himself. "All of you." Carefully, he slid his arms beneath her chest and heaved. For a moment, nothing happened. Her body was impossibly heavy, muscles frozen stiff, fur weighed down with ice. Ethan gritted his teeth and pushed harder. His boot slipped on the icy ground. His knee hit the snow, but he didn't stop. Inch by inch, he lifted her torso just enough to drag her toward the cabin. The storm screamed around them, shoving against his back, trying to force him to let go. He refused. His breath burned in his chest. Snow filled his hood and clung to his eyelashes. His fingers ached despite the gloves. But he kept moving, dragging the massive body of the lioness through the rising drifts. Once her paw slid limply across the snow, and he felt panic seize him. Was she still breathing? He leaned over her muzzle and saw a faint puff of mist leave her nostrils. Relief washed through him, giving him enough strength to keep going. At last, the porch came into view through the blur of white. Ethan hauled her up the small step, nearly slipping again, and used his shoulder to slam the door wider. The warmth from inside spilled out in a rush, but it was faint compared to the storm tearing at his back. He pulled the lioness through the doorway, inch by brutal inch, until her head cleared the threshold. The moment her body crossed into the cabin, he kicked the door shut behind him, sealing out the roar of the storm. Silence fell. Deep, heavy, unbelievable silence. Ethan stood hunched over, panting hard, snow melting off his coat and pooling on the floorboards. The cubs squirmed faintly inside his jacket, reminding him they were still there. He knelt beside the lioness, gently lowering her into a spot near the fire. The flickering glow cast warm light across her frozen coat, making her look almost ghost-like. Steam rose from her fur as the ice began to melt. Her breaths remained shallow, but they were breaths nonetheless. Ethan shrugged off his coat and freed the cubs, placing them close to the flames but far enough not to overheat. He surrounded them with blankets and rubbed their tiny bodies to get their circulation going. They responded with weak mews, curling into the warmth. Only after they were secure did he glance back at Mara. She lay motionless, her head resting on the wooden floor, eyes closed now. If he didn't look close enough, he would think she was already gone. He reached out hesitantly and touched her paw. It was cold, far too cold. He moved quickly, grabbing extra blankets from the sofa, layering them over her back and sides. The fire crackled loudly in the quiet cabin, filling the room with a faint glow. Ethan's hands trembled as he worked. This was madness, bringing a full-grown lioness into his home. If she woke frightened or confused, he could be in unthinkable danger. But as he looked at her, lying half-frozen on his floor, he saw none of that. He saw a mother who had braved the storm for her cubs, a creature pushed beyond its limits by a force that cared nothing for survival. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the fear, he felt something else, a small flicker of purpose, a memory of the man he used to be, the man who would have run into a storm for anyone who needed him. Ethan sat beside her, listening to the faint rhythm of her breaths. He rubbed her chest with a warm towel, working slowly, rhythmically, urging the life back into her limbs. Hours passed, the storm outside never slowing. The lioness never moved. And as the night stretched on, Ethan realized that the cabin, once a place of quiet retreat, had become something else entirely. It had become a lifeline, for her cubs. And in a way he did not yet understand, maybe for him too, Ethan remained kneeling beside the lioness, his palms still resting lightly on her cold fur as the fire crackled behind him. The weight of what he had just done settled over him slowly, like another snowfall blanketing the roof. He drew a shaky breath and stood, rolling his stiff shoulders as warmth finally seeped through his coat. The cubs stirred under the blankets he had wrapped around them. Their tiny chests rose and fell in shallow, fragile rhythms, but at least they were breathing. He crouched beside them and lifted one gently, resting it against his palm. Its fur was still icy, but the trembling had lessened. A spark of hope flickered in him for the first time since he'd stepped outside. He replaced the cub beside its sibling and turned back to the lioness. Mara remained still, her paws limp, her head resting on the wooden floorboards. If not for the faint fog of breath escaping her nostrils, she could have been a statue carved from snow. Her ears twitched once, just barely, a sign that she was still fighting. Ethan knelt again, brushing melting frost from her whiskers. She had survived the storm only to collapse on his doorstep. Her body was giving out. Time mattered now more than ever. He moved quickly, pacing across the cabin to fetch whatever supplies he had. He brought blankets, towels, and the heating pad he used during long nights after hauling timber. He plugged it in and slipped it beneath her chest, careful not to jolt her. The cabin was small, the air thick with the scent of melting snow, smoke, and the faint wild musk of the lioness. It felt surreal, unbelievable that he was doing this. But there was no room for hesitation anymore. He poured warm water into a metal bowl and set it near her. She didn't lift her head. Her breaths stayed shallow, her ribs barely rising. He sat beside her again and rested a trembling hand near her neck, careful not to crowd her. He had treated injured wildlife before. Foxes, wolves, even a black bear once, but never anything like this. Never a mother lion, frozen and starving, lying helpless in his home. "Stay with me," he whispered. "You made it this far. Don't give up now." He wasn't sure why he said it. Maybe to comfort her, maybe to steady himself, maybe because the silence in the cabin felt too heavy, too close to the nights he'd spent wishing he had said those same words to someone he loved. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the mountains, but the cabin held firm. Wind rattled the window panes, and drifts of snow piled against the walls. Ethan glanced toward the photograph of Liam near the window once more. The boy's bright smile reflected the glow of the fire. Ethan's throat tightened. He wondered what his son would have thought of this night, of finding a mother lion and her cubs trembling in the yard, of hauling the massive creature into the cabin by pure determination. Liam had always loved animals, always begged Ethan to bring home anything cool he found on his patrols. The memory stung, but for the first time in a long while, it stung less like a wound and more like a reminder. He turned back to Mara. Her body shuddered faintly under the blankets, and he leaned forward instinctively. She was fighting the cold, the exhaustion, the weight of her own failing strength. He wasn't sure if she would last another hour without help. So he made a decision, one that went against every instinct of self-preservation he'd learned on the mountain. He moved closer, sitting just within reach of her paws. If she woke confused or frightened, well, that was a risk he would take. He had taken many risks in these mountains. This one felt different, more human, more necessary. He warmed a towel near the fire and pressed it gently along her flank, moving slowly so she wouldn't startle. The heat seeped into her fur, loosening the stiffness beneath. Her ears twitched again. Her breathing deepened ever so slightly. Ethan exhaled in relief and continued, warming her limbs one by one. Hours passed. The storm outside raged on, but inside the fire gave the room a muted glow, a fragile sanctuary carved out of the frozen mountainside. Around midnight, he checked the cubs again. One let out a soft cry and nuzzled closer to its sibling. Ethan smiled faintly. "Good," he murmured. "That's good." He checked the lioness next. His fingers hovered near her chest. Her heartbeat remained slow but steadier than before. He sat back and rubbed his weary eyes. His whole body ached from the hours of laboring in the cold and from hauling her across the cabin. But he stayed awake. He couldn't let himself drift, not while 3 lives depended on his vigilance. Now and then he spoke softly, his words mixing with the crackle of the fire and the groan of the storm. "You fought hard out there," he whispered. "Fought harder than most." His voice cracked a little. "I know what that's like." He brushed melting frost from her whiskers again. "You're safe now. Rest. I've got you." Minutes merged into hours. Ethan felt the weight of exhaustion tug at his eyes. but he forced himself to stand and feed the fire with more logs. Flames roared back to life, bathing the room in warmth. He stretched his back and rolled his shoulders before kneeling beside her once more. Her breaths had grown deeper. Slowly, slowly, her body was warming. The storm outside showed no signs of stopping. But as Ethan watched the lioness, he realized something had shifted. Not in her, though she clung stubbornly to life, but in him. For months he had lived in a daze, wandering through days without direction. But now, with a creature so fierce and so vulnerable resting on his floor, something inside him stirred. A sense of purpose, faint but persistent. He sat beside her with his back against the wall, watching the firelight dance across her golden fur. The cubs slept close together, their tiny chests rising and falling. The cabin was quiet except for the wind and the fire and the soft, rhythmic sound of the lioness breathing. As the hour crept past 3 a.m, Ethan pressed a hand gently to her shoulder, feeling the warmth returning beneath the blankets. She moved then, not much, just a faint twitch beneath his hand. Her eyelids fluttered as though she were dreaming, or coming back. He leaned closer, his voice low. "Come on," he whispered. "Wake up. Your babies need you." He paused, staring at her still form. "And maybe I need you too." He didn't understand why he said that. Not yet. But he would. Very soon, everything would change. The cabin felt smaller as the night pressed on, the storm outside shaking the rafters with a steady, relentless fury. Ethan sat beside the lioness, exhaustion tugging at every muscle in his body. But he refused to close his eyes. The fire threw long, wavering shadows along the log walls, each flicker revealing the same fragile truth. 3 lives hung in the balance. The cubs slept beside the hearth, curled into small trembling bundles beneath thick blankets. Their breaths were thin, but they came steady enough to give him hope. Mara, however, remained frighteningly still, her golden fur glistening as it slowly thawed under the fire's warmth. Ethan laid another log on the fire, watching sparks rise and disappear up the chimney. He rubbed his sore hands together, trying to warm the numbness out of his fingers. The cabin's temperature had risen, but it was nowhere near what he wished it could be. He stood and walked to the small kitchen area, filled a kettle with warm water, and dipped a towel into it. With care, he wrung it out and brought it back to the lioness. Kneeling beside her once again, he placed the towel along her ribs, massaging gently to stimulate her circulation. Her skin twitched faintly under his touch, a faint flicker of life trying to resurface. The storm outside continued to howl, rattling the windows with such force that the glass hummed. The sound reminded him of winter nights long ago, when Liam would sit cross-legged on the floor, building small forts from pillows and blankets, while the wind sang through the trees. Ethan's throat tightened. He forced the memory aside and focused on the present, on the mother lion lying motionless on his floor, on the cubs fighting for warmth, on the thin thread of hope running between them. He moved to the cubs and lifted one gently. Its tiny paws curled weakly against his palm, its eyes barely opening. "You're stubborn little fighters," he whispered, stroking its head with the back of his finger. "Just like she is." He returned the cub to its sibling and tugged the blanket closer around them before moving back to Mara. Her breathing remained shallow, her body still stiff with cold. Ethan placed both hands against her flank and began rubbing in slow, firm circles, willing warmth back into her core. Minutes blended into hours. The firelight wavered, casting amber reflections across Mara's thawing coat. Ethan's muscles burned from the constant effort, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. Several times he caught himself swaying from fatigue, his vision going blurry, but he forced himself upright. "Don't you give up," he whispered hoarsely. "Your babies need you." As if responding, one of the cubs let out a small cry from the hearth. A faint, wavering sound that echoed through the cabin. Ethan smiled tiredly. See? Even they're cheering you on. He leaned nearer to Mara's head, watching for the faint rise and fall of her breaths. Her chest lifted only slightly with each inhale, but it was enough. He brushed the towel across her neck, down her shoulders, then along her foreleg, careful not to startle her. Each time he moved the towel, steam rose from her coat, carrying with it a soft, wild scent that reminded him of pine and earth and open spaces far beyond these snow-covered walls. The fire popped loudly, sending a burst of sparks upward. Ethan startled slightly, then sighed. His nerves were frayed. Every sound made him tense, expecting Mara to suddenly jolt awake in fear. But she didn't move except for the faint twitching beneath the blankets. Her stillness was nearly as frightening as the idea of her waking too soon. He needed her alive, awake, breathing, but not before she was strong enough to understand she was safe. He sat down beside her again and rested his back against the wall. The warmth of the fire and the steady rhythm of his own heartbeat filled the room. The storm's distant roar mixed with the quiet crackle of burning wood. It was a strange sort of peace, raw, fragile, and full of something that felt dangerously close to hope. He glanced toward the cubs again, their small bodies moving in soft waves as they breathed. 3 heartbeats, he murmured. Hanging on. He placed a hand gently on Mara's ribs. Come on, girl. Don't leave them. Don't leave me with ghosts. Time stretched, marked by the slow melting of ice from her fur and the burning logs collapsing into embers. The room grew warmer, the fire glowing brighter as Ethan fed it, refusing to let it die. He dipped the towel into the hot water again and gently pressed it against her chest. This time, she reacted with a low, faint rumble, not a growl, but a sound of deep exhaustion. Ethan froze. Then slowly, he smiled. There you are, he whispered. He continued rubbing, coaxing her muscles back to life. Every few minutes he would pause to listen, checking for any change in her breathing, any sign of improvement or decline. The cubs let out soft mews here and there, their voices small but insistent in the quiet cabin. He tended to them when needed, rubbing their backs and placing them closer to the fire before returning to Mara's savanna. Hours passed, but Ethan refused to rest. He worked tirelessly, sometimes glancing toward the window where the storm continued to swirl in thick waves of white. Outside was death. Inside, life fought desperately to survive, barely, but still fighting. Mara's breaths deepened ever so slightly as the night waned. Her body softened under the blankets, no longer as rigid with cold. Ethan sat still for a moment, letting the reality wash over him. You're coming back, he whispered, slowly, but you're coming back. His words were barely audible, but in the quiet cabin, they echoed like a promise. The night finally began to loosen its grip. The storm's rage softened into a distant hum. The first pale hints of dawn ghosted along the window frame. Ethan rubbed his eyes and blinked at the faint light. His entire body shook from exhaustion, but he felt something else too. A steady, quiet relief. The cubs breathed easier. Mara's heartbeat beneath his palm felt stronger. 3 lives still held on. As the fire cracked softly and the sky outside brightened with the first whisper of morning, Ethan allowed himself to lean back against the wall, still watching Mara closely. It wasn't over. But for the first time since he found them in the snow, he believed they might make it. And that belief alone was enough to carry him into the uncertain dawn. The first light of morning crept into the cabin quietly, touching the worn floorboards and brushing against the blankets covering the cubs. Ethan sat with his back against the wall, his eyelids heavy but refusing to close. He had drifted into a half-sleep once or twice, the kind where thoughts blend with memories. But each time the crackle of the fire or a soft whimper from the cubs pulled him back. He wasn't ready to let go of wakefulness, not while so much rested on the edge between life and loss. The storm outside had softened into a distant wind, leaving behind a world muted and white. Inside, the fire glowed steadily, warming the air enough for Ethan to finally take a full breath without feeling cold in his lungs. He pushed himself upright, stretching stiff muscles that ached from hours of labor. The cubs were still bundled together near the fire, their tiny chests rising and falling in a much steadier rhythm than the night before. He knelt beside them and gently brushed his fingertips along their backs. One of them let out a sleepy, squeaking murmur and pushed its nose deeper into the warmth. Ethan let a tired smile spread across his face. "You're tougher than you look," he whispered. Then his attention returned to Mara. The lioness lay exactly where he had left her, on the thick blankets he'd arranged near the fireplace. Her massive body stretched out. Her paws relaxed instead of curled rigidly with cold. Her fur had dried in patches, though the ends were still damp and clumped from the melted ice. Ethan approached slowly, not wanting to disturb whatever fragile piece she rested in. He crouched beside her and placed 2 fingers gently along her ribcage. Her breaths were deeper now, steadier. Her heartbeat felt stronger beneath the warmth of her fur. "Come on," he murmured. "You're almost there." He reached for another towel, dipped it into warm water, and wrung it out before pressing it gently along her shoulder. The warmth seeped into her muscles, causing a faint twitch beneath his hand. Ethan froze at the motion, not out of fear, but out of stunned relief. He leaned closer, watching the trembling travel down her front leg. "There you go," he whispered. "Come back to us." For a long while, nothing else happened. The cabin remained quiet, except for the soft, rhythmic breathing of the cubs, the steady crackle of the fire, and the quiet hum of the heater Ethan had plugged in earlier. He continued massaging her limbs, working from her shoulders down to her paws. Every so often he paused to feed the fire, adding logs until the flames flared back up. The warmth radiated through the cabin, chasing away the last remnants of the storm's chill. He had just set another log on the fire when a sound behind him made him pause. A soft, low exhale, longer, deeper than before. He turned slowly. Mara's chest rose, then fell in a slow, controlled motion. Her ears twitched. Her tail shifted a fraction of an inch beneath the blankets. Ethan knelt beside her again, unsure if this was another involuntary response or the first sign of waking. His heart pounded as he leaned closer. Her eyes moved beneath her closed lids. A moment later, they opened. Not wide, just a sliver at first, a thin line of golden amber glinting in the dim firelight. Ethan froze, breath catching in his throat. She blinked once, then again, her gaze trying to focus. Her pupils narrowed slightly in the warm cabin light. Her breathing changed too, no longer slow and shallow, but controlled, almost measured. She lifted her head an inch, then let it drop again, the effort too much. But her eyes stayed open, drifting across the room until they settled on him. Their eyes met. Everything inside Ethan stilled. There was no growl, no flash of teeth, no instinctive lunge of fear or aggression. Her gaze was heavy, ancient, and tired, full of exhaustion but also awareness. She knew him, or at least she knew that he was the one who pulled her from the snow, the one who warmed her cubs, the one who had chosen to fight alongside her against the storm. "You're awake," he whispered, barely daring to breathe. "Good girl. You made it." Mara blinked slowly. Her eyes shifted to the blankets near the fire where her cubs lay. When she saw them moving, alive, breathing normally, her chest rose sharply in what almost looked like relief. She let out a soft, faint huff through her nose, a sound warmer and more emotional than Ethan expected from a wild predator. Her gaze returned to him once more. Ethan moved slowly, keeping his hands in plain sight. "It's all right," he said. "You're safe here. They're safe too." Mara tried again to lift her head. This time, she managed to raise it a few inches before letting it fall gently back onto the blanket. Ethan could see the strain in her muscles, the effort it took just to move. But the attempt alone reassured him. She wasn't slipping away anymore. She was climbing back, inch by inch. As she rested, Ethan slid a bowl of warm water closer to her. "Try," he murmured. "Just a sip if you can." She didn't move toward it, but her eyes followed the bowl. It might take time. He wasn't worried. Time was something he could give. He sat beside her for a long while, saying nothing. The cabin was warm now, and the quiet inside it felt different, less like loneliness and more like a fragile kind of hope. Outside, the mountains were still buried under layers of snow, but the storm had passed. Dawn painted faint streaks of gold across the frosted window. Mara watched him through half-lidded eyes, her gaze steady despite her exhaustion. It was strange, being studied by a creature so powerful, so wild, yet so vulnerable. Ethan felt something shift inside him. Not fear, not guilt. Something quieter, something that felt like connection. He reached for another towel, warmed it by the fire, and pressed it gently along her side. Her eyes closed again, not in unconsciousness, but in rest. "You rest," he whispered. "I'll keep watch." The calfskin coat hanging near the door rustled as another soft gust of wind brushed the cabin. The fire popped. The cubs let out small, dreamlike murmurs in their sleep. Mara lay peacefully now, her breathing slow and steady, warmth returning to her limbs as the day grew brighter. Ethan leaned back against the wall and let his tired body relax for the first time in hours. The storm had taken nearly everything from her. But now, dawn brought something new, something neither of them expected. A beginning. And somewhere deep in Mara's steady gaze, Ethan sensed that the moment her eyes had opened, the world inside this cabin had quietly changed for both of them. The morning light continued to seep into the cabin, soft and pale, settling over everything with a gentleness that felt almost unreal after the brutal storm of the night before. Ethan sat close to the fire, rubbing warmth into his tired hands as he watched Mara recover bit by bit. Her eyes, though heavy with exhaustion, stayed open now, drifting between the cubs and him with a kind of calm that both reassured him and humbled him. He had seen wild animals look alert, terrified, confused, even protective. But the look she gave him was something else entirely. It was recognition, not trust yet, but the beginnings of it. He rose slowly, making sure his movements were deliberate and easy to follow so she wouldn't panic. She lifted her head a few inches, tracking him as he crossed to the kitchen to prepare a bit of warm broth. "Just something gentle," he murmured to himself, though he kept his voice soft enough that it wouldn't startle her. He poured the warm broth into a shallow metal pan and slid it across the floor toward her. She didn't move to drink, but her nose twitched, catching the scent. That alone was progress. He stepped back and knelt near the cubs. They had begun to stir, blinking up at him with sleepy eyes. Their tiny noses twitched as they scented their mother. One gave a small, shaky cry. The sound made Mara shift immediately. She tried to rise, but her legs wobbled beneath her. She managed only a slight lift before her strength gave out, and she sank back down, panting. Ethan was already there, sliding a blanket under her chest to support her. "Easy," he whispered. "You'll get there. Just not yet." The cubs wriggled weakly beneath their blankets, and he brought them closer, one at a time. Mara's eyes softened the moment she saw them. She stretched her head toward them, pressing her nose gently into their fur. Ethan felt his throat tighten. There was no mistaking the emotion in that moment. It was relief. Pure, quiet relief. She nudged each cub as if counting them, checking them, making sure the storm hadn't taken more from her than it already had. For several long minutes, mother and cubs stayed that way, reunited, breathing warm air into a space that had felt frozen with fear for so many hours. Ethan didn't move. He didn't want to break the spell of peace filling the room. He remembered holding his own son like that, hands cupped around a small, warm body that trusted him completely. The memory brought a deep ache, but also something strangely healing. Grief and comfort rising together, neither overpowering the other. When the cubs settled down again, nestled against their mother's side, Ethan resumed his slow work. He warmed another towel, then knelt to rub heat back into Mara's legs. Her eyes flicked toward him, watching every motion. But there was no tension in her gaze, only awareness. She wasn't afraid of him anymore. She wasn't confused or defensive. She was simply observing, letting him near her without a hint of aggression. It was astonishing, almost unbelievable, considering the danger she could pose when healthy. "You know I'm trying to help you," he said softly. "Don't know how you know it, but you do." The hours passed like this, steady, patient, quiet. The storm outside remained a faded presence, brushing faint winds against the cabin walls. Inside, warmth grew, both from the fire and from something deeper. Ethan found himself speaking to her in a slow, even voice as he worked, not expecting an answer, but needing the connection. He told her about the mountain trails, the harsh winters he'd survived, the seasons he'd spent alone after losing Liam. She listened, or maybe she only watched. But either way, there was a stillness between them that made the cabin feel fuller than it had in years. Mara's strength returned little by little. Her breathing grew steady. Her tail flicked once beneath the blankets. At one point, she tried lifting herself again, and this time she managed to scoot her weight forward without collapsing. Ethan immediately placed a steadying hand near her shoulder, not touching unless she needed the support, but offering it all the same. She glanced at him, her eyes calm, and he had no doubt that if she'd wanted him gone, she would have shown it. Instead, she remained where she was, letting him help her. It was an unspoken agreement, a fragile truce neither of them could name aloud, but they both felt. By midday, the cabin had warmed enough that Ethan removed a few layers of blankets from the cubs. They wriggled out of their nest, paws stumbling in the clumsy way of newborns. One approached Ethan cautiously, its tiny nose bumping the back of his hand before retreating. Mara lifted her head, watching carefully, but not reacting with fear or instinctive protectiveness. Her only response was a slow blink, as if acknowledging that she understood. He meant no harm. He smiled at her. "Looks like your little ones are braver than you think." He checked her limbs again and worked the warmth deeper into her muscles. She let out a low, deep rumble, not threatening but reassuring, almost grateful. It vibrated through the floor and into his palms. Ethan sat back, stunned for a moment. A wild lioness didn't make that sound unless she accepted the presence beside her. It was then, in the quiet midday light, that Ethan realized something he hadn't allowed himself to feel for a long time. He wasn't alone. Not anymore. Grief had carved him hollow, but something in this fragile, improbable situation filled the space in a way he hadn't expected. The lioness lowered her head onto her paws and watched him with an intensity that brought goosebumps to his arms. Her cubs curled beside her, safe, warm, alive. The fire crackled. The world outside lay buried under snow, but inside the cabin something gentle, something almost sacred, had settled. A bond. Tentative, fragile, unspoken, but real. As afternoon passed and evening crept across the mountains, Ethan continued caring for all three of them, warming broth, tending the fire, checking their breathing. And Mara, in her exhaustion, kept her gaze on him, never with fear, never with suspicion. In that silence, a promise formed between them without a single word spoken. She would not harm him, and he would not abandon her. Not now, not ever. The vow settled silently in Ethan's chest as the hours drifted into late afternoon. Outside the cabin window, the world remained blanketed in a heavy white stillness, a deceptive calm left behind by the storm that had nearly claimed all their lives. The snow no longer fell, but the mountains held their breath in that eerie quiet that only comes after a blizzard has exhausted itself. Ethan glanced at the frosted glass, watching thin rays of winter sunlight reflect off the endless powdered landscape. The storm had ended, but the cold still clung fiercely to the world outside. Inside the small cabin, warmth pooled in pockets around the fire, filling the room with a soft glow. Mara rested more comfortably now, her breathing slow but steady, her cubs nestled close against her belly. Ethan checked on them one more time, rubbing gentle circles over their backs until they wriggled contentedly. The lioness watched him without tension, her eyes calm and her ears relaxed, a posture he never would have imagined witnessing from such a wild creature. But the quiet inside the cabin couldn't hide the reality. They were running out of supplies. Firewood was low, dangerously low, and the temperature outside was already dropping with the lengthening shadows. Ethan rose slowly from the floor, stretching out the ache in his back. He counted the remaining logs beside the fireplace. Only a small pile remained. Maybe a few hours of heat at best. The storm had forced him to burn through more wood in a single night than he normally used in 2 days. He cursed under his breath softly, rubbing a hand across his jaw. The shed wasn't far, just a short walk beyond the porch. Under normal circumstances, it would be a trivial trip. But the storm had reshaped the land, piling drifts high enough to bury the knee-high markers along his path. He glanced at Mara. Her eyes followed him, alert but trusting, as he slipped on his coat and gloves. "I won't be long," he said quietly. "Just need to get more wood. You stay warm, all right?" She blinked slowly, her breath creating faint wisps in the glow of the fire. Her cubs stirred but remained curled in their blanket nest. Ethan pulled his hat down over his ears and stepped closer to the door. Cold seeped through the wood, reminding him of the storm's lingering presence. He hesitated, hand resting on the latch, listening. The wind outside was quiet, almost unnervingly so. That false calm should have reassured him, but instead it made him uneasy. He opened the door a crack and felt a blast of frigid air rush in, stirring the warmth of the cabin. Snow nearly shoulder-deep blocked the path ahead. The sky above was a pale, washed-out blue, the sun hanging low like a cold lamp behind wisps of clouds. Ethan stepped outside carefully, pulling the door shut behind him. The world felt foreign, reshaped. Mountains of snow covered the yard, smoothing out every line he knew. The shed sat halfway buried near the tree line, its roof sagging slightly under the weight of the storm. Ethan inhaled deeply, the cold slicing through his lungs like a blade. Then he started forward, pressing his boots deep into the snow with each heavy step. The path was harder than he anticipated. The storm had drifted snow in unpredictable ways, creating pockets where his legs sank nearly to his hips. He forced his weight upward, pushing through the drifts with slow, grueling effort. The shed loomed ahead, its door barely visible beneath a layer of ice. The wind brushed lightly around him, whispering through the pines, a steady, low hum that felt almost comforting after the night's chaos. But then the wind changed. It shifted direction abruptly, carrying with it a deep, distant sound, a groaning, a rumbling that vibrated beneath his boots. Ethan stopped, breath stilled. He held himself completely still, listening. The sound came again, louder this time, cracking like thunder rolling through snow-choked valleys. His heart jumped. "No, not now," he breathed. He turned his head slowly toward the mountain slope above. The sunlight caught the edges of the ridge, revealing a sight that made his blood run cold. A crack, thin but stretching wide, cut across the mountainside. Snow along the ridge quivered, sliding just an inch, then another. Ethan's breath hitched. He knew that sound. He'd heard it before during avalanche rescues. It was the sound of a mountain shifting its weight, the sound of buried layers giving way, the sound of a slope about to fall. He took a single step backward, eyes never leaving the ridge. "No, no, no," he whispered, feeling dread crawl up his spine. The crack widened. A chunk of snow broke free, then another. The rumble deepened, echoing across the still white plain like a warning from the earth itself. And then the entire slope moved. It started as a soft slide, hardly noticeable. Then the snow surged downward in a massive wave, slow at first, then accelerating with terrifying speed. The avalanche raced down the mountain like a tidal surge of white, devouring everything in its path. Ethan turned and ran, his boots sinking deep into the powder. The air filled with the deafening roar of collapsing snow, a sound so immense it drowned out his own breath. He pushed forward desperately, stumbling through the drifts as the avalanche thundered closer. Snow exploded upward behind him as the waves slammed into the base of the slope. He felt the ground shudder beneath him. He forced his legs to move, each step slower than the last. His breath came in ragged gasps. He could see the cabin in the distance, so close, yet impossibly far through the heavy snow. The avalanche hit the flatland with unimaginable force, sending a rush of icy wind blasting outward. Ethan cried out as the shockwave struck him, knocking him off balance. He fell forward, plunging into the snow face first. He tried to rise, but the force of the moving snow pulled at him, dragging him backward. Panic surged through him. He clawed at the snow, but it offered no purchase. The wave was upon him. The world went white. Ethan felt himself lifted, thrown, buried beneath layers of crushing cold. Snow swallowed him whole, forcing the breath from his lungs. Darkness flickered at the edges of his vision. He twisted instinctively, trying to find air, trying to fight the weight pressing in from all sides. He couldn't tell which way was up. The world was silent again. Eerily silent. But the silence was suffocating. His chest burned. His leg twisted sharply, pain flaring bright and hot. He gasped, but snow filled his mouth. He choked and spat it out, fighting for a pocket of air. His hands clawed against the icy weight that pinned him. It didn't move. Nothing moved. His heartbeat slowed, heavy and desperate. In that crushing stillness, through the roar fading in his ears, he thought of Mara, of her cubs, of the fragile connection that had grown between them in the last 24 hours. He thought of Liam, his smile, his laughter echoing in the cabin once upon a time. All of it washed together in a single, heartbreaking moment. He wasn't ready to die. Not again. Not like this. Not when life, 3 small lives, waited inside that cabin, counting on him. But the snow pressed harder, squeezing the thoughts from his mind. His world dimmed into white, then into nothing at all. Silence swallowed everything. Not the peaceful kind Ethan once found in the quiet corners of his cabin, but a smothering, suffocating stillness where sound could not travel and breath could not rise. He drifted in that colorless void, unsure if seconds passed or minutes or something much longer. Slowly, painfully, awareness crept back into his body. A sharp, throbbing ache pulsed through his leg, and cold seeped so deeply into him that it felt like part of his bones. He tried to inhale. Snow filled the space where air should have been. His body panicked before his mind could. He coughed, gagged, and spat out ice crystals as his lungs begged for even the smallest pocket of oxygen. One tremor of movement sent needles of agony shooting from his twisted leg up through his side. He clenched his jaw, trying not to pass out again. The darkness behind his eyelids pulsed rhythmically, as if urging him to simply surrender. to slip back into the nothingness that had taken him moments ago. But instinct refused. Life refused. He forced himself to move an arm, then a hand, though it felt like lifting a mountain. His glove scraped against packed snow, so dense it might as well have been stone. He pushed again, this time harder. Nothing shifted. He tried to twist his torso. A stab of pain in his hip stopped him cold. He groaned into the frozen earth, wondering how deep he was buried. Inches? Feet? Could anyone even find him out here? His breath grew ragged as panic coiled tight in his chest. He closed his eyes and tried to steady himself. "Stay calm," he whispered into the crushing cold, though the sound barely reached his own ears. "Find air first. Find air." His glove brushed upward, desperate, searching for any pocket. After several tries, a tiny space opened above his face, just enough for a thin trickle of cold air to reach him. He gasped, shallow and rapid, but he could breathe. Barely. He blinked through the darkness. There was no up, no down, just white and shadows. Snow pinned his left leg at an angle legs were never meant to bend. The pain radiated through him in waves that blurred the edges of reality. He refused to look at the injury, even mentally. Accepting its severity felt like accepting defeat. And he wasn't done fighting. Not yet. Memories flickered. Mara lying weakly on the cabin floor, her cubs mewling faintly in their blanket nest. The warmth of the fire he had kept alive through the night. The fragile trust in her eyes when she awoke. He could not leave them. He would not leave them. But the cold was relentless. The weight of the snow pressed against his ribs until every breath felt like a losing battle. His fingers went numb first. Then the sensation crept up his arms and legs, threatening to swallow him whole. He fought to stay awake, knowing that sleep, here beneath tons of snow, was not sleep at all. It was surrender, and surrender meant the mountains would take him the same way they'd taken Liam. "Not like this," he whispered hoarsely, teeth chattering uncontrollably. "Not again." His voice broke. He squeezed his eyes shut, fighting back the sting of hopelessness that rose in his chest. The memory of his son felt too close, too sharp. Liam's laughter echoed in the back of his mind, warm and bright and so painfully out of place in this cold tomb. Ethan's throat tightened. "I'm sorry," he murmured to the darkness. I should have been there sooner." The ache of regret threatened to undo what little strength he had left. He took another shallow breath, forcing himself back into the present. "Mara," he whispered. "Your cubs." The words froze in the air before they could finish, swallowed by the cold. He didn't know how long he lay there, suspended between consciousness and the creeping numbness slipping into his veins. The world narrowed to the sound of his own breathing. Thin, uneven, rasping. Each inhale felt like a miracle. Each exhale felt like it could be his last. Then he felt something. A faint tremor. A vibration through the snow. At first he thought it was his imagination. A flicker of hope from a mind starved for salvation. He held his breath, listening. The tremor came again, stronger this time. A low, rhythmic thudding. Not wind, not shifting ice. Something. Moving. He strained to listen. The thudding grew louder, faster, closer. Snow above him shifted, sending a few grains trickling down onto his face. His heart leapt painfully. Could it be a search team? No. Too soon. They wouldn't even know he was missing yet. And even if they did, no one could reach this area in time. The storm had blanketed the roads. The radio tower had gone silent hours earlier. There was only one possibility left, one that made his breath catch in disbelief. But he couldn't afford to hope. Not yet. The tremor strengthened. Snow cracked above him. He braced himself, fearing another collapse. Instead, A small shaft of light pierced the whiteness, cutting through the darkness like a single golden blade. Air rushed in, fresh and cold, filling his lungs with an ache so sharp he nearly cried out. Then, a sound, a familiar sound, a deep, powerful rumble, not thunder, not ice, a voice, her voice. The snow shifted again, and a cascade of loose powder fell away from his face. Through the tiny gap, he saw something impossible. An eye, golden, fierce, determined. It blinked once, clearing snow from its lashes. Ethan felt tears fill his own eyes, freezing instantly against his skin. "Mara," he whispered, voice cracking. The lioness dug frantically, her massive paws scooping away the snow with wild, desperate urgency. She worked tirelessly, breath huffing out in hot bursts that melted the frost around him. Her movements were fast but careful, as if she somehow knew exactly where he was buried, exactly how deep she needed to dig. Snow fell away in chunks, opening the pocket around him wider and wider. He closed his eyes for a moment, overwhelmed. She had come for him. The mountain had taken him, but she had refused to let it keep him. Her rumbling cries echoed through the snowy hollow, vibrating through his chest like a heartbeat not his own. Ethan tried to lift an arm toward her, but pain shot through him so sharply he gasped. Mara's digging intensified, her paws working with a strength he didn't think she had left. A low growl rose from her throat, not of anger, but of determination, a primal refusal to lose him the way he'd lost so much already. The snow gave way faster now, collapsing downward as she broke through layer after layer. Light flooded the small cavity. Ethan sucked in a breath of air so cold it burned. Mara thrust her head deeper, her nose brushing against his shoulder. A soft, urgent rumble spilled from her chest, a sound that felt like a command to hold on. "I'm here," he whispered. "I'm still here." She didn't stop. She wouldn't stop. Not until he was free. The world around Ethan shook with every desperate stroke of Mara's paws. Snow cascaded down in heavy sheets, opening the narrow pocket around him inch by inch. Her breath hit his skin in hot bursts, melting the frost that had crept into his beard, her whiskers brushing his cheek as she pressed closer. The rumble in her chest was steady, almost rhythmic, an urgent primal call cutting through the suffocating silence of the avalanche. Ethan forced his eyes open, blinking against the sudden brightness filtering through the widening gap above him. He could see part of her face now, her golden eyes wide with fierce determination, her nostrils flaring as she cleared snow in frantic swipes. He tried to move his arms, but pain shot from his leg to his spine in a blinding flash. A choked sound escaped his throat. Mara froze instantly. Her ears twitched, her gaze dropping to his twisted leg. She let out a low, vibrating groan, soft, mournful, before resuming her digging, gentler this time, pushing snow away from him without disturbing the buried limb. The deliberate care in her movements stunned him. Even weakened, even desperate, she somehow chose to be careful. "Easy, girl," he whispered, though his voice trembled. I'm right here." The digging continued, her paws carving at the wall of snow with a strength he had not seen since she first appeared at his cabin door. Snow flew in bursts, landing around him like soft explosions. Each swipe carved the cavity wider, letting in more light, more air, more life. Ethan sucked in a deep breath, no longer fearing he might run out of oxygen. He lifted a shaking hand toward her, fingers brushing the edge of her fur. She paused again, leaning her head down to him. Her nose pressed lightly to his cheek, warm and alive. Then she let out a small, throaty sound, a low, insistent chirp he had heard her use only once, toward her cubs on that first night. It wasn't a command, it wasn't a growl, it was reassurance, a message. "Hold on." Then she returned to her work with renewed urgency. Ethan's fingers curled weakly into the snow. His body trembled from cold and pain, but for the first time since the avalanche had taken him, He no longer felt alone. He blinked away tears that froze on his lashes. The mountains had taken so much from him. But now, impossibly, they were giving something back through this creature he had once feared. A wild lioness was fighting harder for his life than he could fight for his own. A sudden, sharp crack boomed overhead. Ethan flinched. Mara whipped her head upward, ears flattening. The snow above shifted dangerously. Ethan's breath hitched. Another slide was building. Mara moved immediately, planting herself over him, her body shielding him from the shifting snow. She pressed close, her weight warm and solid against his shoulder. The snow groaned above them, the surface settling in thick ripples. A rush of white dust fell around them, but the ground didn't collapse further. Mara remained still, bracing, waiting. When the tremor subsided, she moved again, faster than before. Her paws worked tirelessly, fearless in their precision. Snow flew from the cavity in heavy bursts as she dug toward the open air. Ethan could see her muscles tense with every swipe, see the exhaustion trembling in her limbs. But she didn't stop, not even for a moment. A distant sound reached them then, thin but growing louder. Mara's ears perked. She paused her digging, lifting her head toward the direction of the noise. Ethan strained to listen. Through the muffled layers of snow came the faint whine of an alarm beacon, the backup system wired to his cabin's generator. It must have tripped when the cabin lost power during the avalanche. He closed his eyes. Hope seared through him like light. The alarm would alert the ranger station. They might already be on their way. Mara turned back to him, leaning close, breathing warm air into the frozen hollow. Then she released a sound Ethan had not heard from her before. A deep, echoing roar muffled by snow, but powerful enough to vibrate the earth around them. It rolled through the frozen air, a call that could travel across valleys, a call of urgency and command, a call meant to guide. She lifted her head again and roared once more, longer this time, louder. Ethan lay stunned beneath her, feeling her voice tremble through his ribs. The roar spread beyond the hollow, out into the world where humans could hear it. Her cubs answered. Faintly, from far closer than Ethan would ever have believed, two high-pitched cries echoed across the snow. Mara froze, her ears swiveling. She responded with a lower, commanding rumble. The cubs answered again, their calls carrying through the still mountain air. They were alive, safe enough to venture out, looking for her. The sound of their voices sparked something inside Mara, an urgency sharper than before. She resumed digging, her movements now filled with renewed strength. Snow fell away faster, the cavity widening until Ethan could see the shifting sky above, a faint blue smeared with white. Light poured in so bright he had to squint. Another sound rose over the wind, a distant hum growing louder. Helicopter blades, a rescue team. Ethan let out a sob of relief he couldn't contain. He wasn't going to die here. Mara cleared the last barrier of snow with a final, powerful swipe. Cold air blasted through the opening, but it smelled of open sky and freedom. She lowered her head and pressed her forehead gently against Ethan's shoulder, nuzzling him before stepping back far enough for rescuers to spot them. She positioned herself over him, her massive body shielding him from the wind. Minutes later, though it felt like hours, the first rescuers reached the site. They froze in disbelief at the sight before them. A wild lioness standing guard over a half-buried man, roaring toward them not in warning, but as if demanding their help. Mara didn't leave him, didn't back away, didn't run. She stayed beside him, her breath warm against his cheek, until the rescuers dug the rest of the snow away and carefully lifted him to safety. And only then, when she was certain he was no longer dying beneath the weight of the mountain, did she step aside. Not far, just enough. Still watching, still protecting. Her rescue complete, her debt repaid, her bond with him unbroken. For a long moment, The rescuers stood frozen on the snow-packed slope, their breath pluming in the cold air as they stared at the lioness towering protectively over Ethan. The scene was so unreal, so far removed from anything they had ever trained for, that none of them moved. Mara stood over him with her body angled toward the approaching figures, her ears pinned back but not in aggression, only in fierce vigilance. Her tail flicked once, slow and controlled. She wasn't threatening them. She was warning the world itself that her human was hurt, and anyone approaching him had better come with pure intentions. The team leader, a grizzled ranger named Holt, raised a gloved hand to halt the others. Snow dusted his shoulders as he took a cautious step forward. He had lived through 30 winters in these mountains and had never seen anything like this. "Easy. Easy there, girl," he whispered, even though the wind carried his voice thinly across the frozen ground. "We're here to help him." Mara let out a low, rumbling sound that vibrated through the air. It wasn't a threat. It was something closer to pleading, an anxious growl of a mother and a protector combined. She lowered her massive head and nudged Ethan gently, as if trying to show them he needed help. Holt swallowed, stunned by the tenderness in the lioness's movement. He took another slow step forward. Ethan drifted between consciousness and pain. His vision blurred in waves, but he felt the warmth of Mara's breath still brushing against his cheek. He heard muffled voices somewhere beyond the rushing in his ears. He forced his eyes open, blinking up at the sky. The sun had broken through the clouds, sending a faint shimmer of light over the snow. "Mara," he rasped. His voice was barely audible. "It's okay. They're here." The lioness turned her head toward him immediately, responding to the faint whisper. She leaned close, her nose touching his forehead. The rescuers watched, wide-eyed and speechless. Holt finally found his voice. "Good Lord," he breathed. "She's guarding him." One of the younger rescuers whispered, Do we try to move him? With her right there?" Holt shook his head slowly. "Not until she understands we're not here to harm him." They waited. Mara remained tense, her muscles coiled despite her recent exhaustion. She watched each movement the rescuers made with laser-sharp focus. Holt crouched carefully, lowering himself to appear less threatening. He extended an open palm in Mara's direction. Snowflakes drifted across it. "We need to help him," he said softly. "Let us help." Mara's eyes narrowed, assessing. Ethan stirred again, his breath rattling. When she saw the pain shudder through him, something shifted in her posture. She exhaled a heavy, trembling breath and stepped to the side. Not far, not enough to relinquish her guard, but enough to give the rescuers space. Holt's eyebrows shot up. "She moved," he whispered. "Move fast," Ethan murmured. His voice was faint, fading. "My leg. Can't feel—" Two rescuers rushed forward, kneeling beside him as Holt stood watch between them and Mara. They cleared the rest of the snow carefully, freeing his torso and arms. Ethan gasped when they shifted his injured leg. Mara let out a low, warning rumble. Holt raised both palms, steadying her. "It's okay, girl. They're helping, just helping." As they examined Ethan, one of the rescuers swore under his breath. "His leg's broken bad. Might be fractured in more than one place." He looked up at Holt. "We need the stretcher now." Mara's ears twitched at the word stretcher. She took a step toward them, her eyes flickering with panic as they lifted Ethan gently. When he winced in pain, she snarled, a short, sharp sound that echoed across the snow. The young rescuer froze. Holt stepped quickly between them again. "Easy!" he barked softly. "No one's hurting him. Look!" He motioned to Ethan. "Talk to her." Ethan forced himself to focus, clenching his teeth against the pain. He reached a shaking hand toward Mara. "I'm okay," he whispered. "You saved me. You did it. I'm okay now." Mara's tense muscles loosened, her tail lowered. She stepped closer and pressed her forehead lightly to his chest, breathing him in. Ethan's hand slid weakly along her cheek. "Thank you," he murmured. "Thank you for coming." Holt swallowed hard, watching the exchange with disbelief and awe. "Let's move," he finally said quietly, "before the weather turns again." They secured Ethan onto the stretcher, wrapping him in thermal blankets. Mara walked beside them the entire time, her eyes never leaving him. Her cubs appeared from behind a snowdrift, their tiny bodies bounding toward their mother. They circled her legs with soft cries. She lowered her head to them, reassuring each with a soft brush of her muzzle, but her attention kept darting back to Ethan. As the rescuers made their slow descent toward the helicopter waiting on a lower ridge, Mara followed. Not aggressively, not fearfully, with purpose, with loyalty. She moved like a guardian shadow at their flank. The rescuers exchanged glances. None dared approach her. None dared question the silent pact between man and lion. When they reached the helicopter, the cubs stopped abruptly, frightened by the loud, churning blades. Mara gently nudged them back, keeping them safe from the blast of wind. Holt approached her cautiously. "He has to go now," he said softly. "We'll take care of him. You did your part." Mara looked past him at Ethan, who lay strapped to the stretcher, barely conscious. Their eyes met one last time before he was lifted into the helicopter. Ethan felt tears slide down his cheeks. "Goodbye, girl. Stay safe." Mara let out a soft, mournful cry, a sound that pierced even through the roar of the engine. The cubs pressed against her legs. Snow swirled around them as the helicopter lifted off the ground. Ethan watched through the small window, his vision blurring as the lioness grew smaller and smaller, her golden form glowing faintly against the endless white. She stood perfectly still until the helicopter disappeared over the ridge. Only then did she release a deep, trembling breath, gather her cubs close, and turn toward the mountains. The bond they had forged in the storm remained, stretching silently across the frozen wilderness, like a thread that neither distance nor time could break. By the time Ethan woke in the hospital, the world outside the window had begun to thaw. Pale sunlight rested across the parking lot, reflecting off slush and patches of stubborn snow. His leg was wrapped in a thick cast, elevated on a stack of pillows. Every movement sent a dull ache through him, but he welcomed the pain. It meant he was alive. Nurses came and went, checking his vitals, adjusting his blankets, offering warm meals and careful smiles. They treated him with gentle professionalism, but none of them could answer the question that lingered like a silent heartbeat in his mind. Had she survived? Had the cubs? He asked the rangers what they'd seen. They spoke in hushed tones about the lioness who refused to leave his side until he was lifted onto the helicopter, about her courage, about how she stood in the blasting wind, guarding him with a devotion none of them had ever witnessed from a wild predator. Every story they shared painted the same picture. Mara had not run from danger. She had run toward him. But after the helicopter took off, she and her cubs disappeared into the vast white wilderness. No tracks, no sightings. Nothing but the memory of her golden coat against the snow. Days turned into weeks. Ethan's recovery was slow, marked by pain, physical therapy, and long stretches of quiet reflection. He often found himself staring out the hospital window, watching the landscape change as winter loosened its grip. He felt strangely restless, as if part of him were still on that mountain, listening for the lioness's call, waiting for her to appear around the next bend. When the doctors finally cleared him to return to his cabin, he packed slowly, carefully folding his clothes, placing his boots by the door, gathering the small personal items he'd brought. A nurse wheeled him to the exit, but he insisted on standing as he stepped outside. The air smelled of pine and melting snow. The cold nipped at his cheeks like an old friend greeting him after a long absence. The ranger station arranged to drive him home. As the truck rumbled along the narrow mountain road, Ethan watched the landscape roll by. Frozen rivers cracking under the warmth of the sun, slopes shedding their coats of ice, trees shaking loose the last remnants of winter. He felt both comforted and unsettled. The mountains had a way of holding memories, and these peaks held more than he could name. When they reached his cabin, he sat for a moment before stepping out. The building stood exactly as he'd left it, sturdy, weather-beaten, surrounded by towering pines. Snow still hugged the base of the walls, but the roof was clear, and thin smoke drifted from the chimney where the rangers had kept the place warm for his return. The familiar scent of wood smoke wrapped around him as he stepped onto the porch. Inside, everything was just as he'd remembered. The old armchair near the fire, the photograph of Liam tucked into the window frame, the blankets folded neatly, waiting. He walked slowly through the cabin, fingers trailing over surfaces, grounding himself in the reality of being home. But the silence felt different now. Not empty, not heavy, just waiting. Days passed. Ethan regained strength little by little. He walked short distances outside, leaning heavily on a cane the rangers had given him. The mountains were beginning to wake from their winter slumber. Birds returned. Branches budded with the first hints of spring. The quiet no longer hurt. It felt alive. And yet, each time he stepped onto the porch, his eyes drifted to the ridgeline above the cabin. The ridge where the avalanche had begun. The ridge where Mara had disappeared with her cubs. He told himself not to expect anything. Wild animals did not return to say goodbye. They did not honor promises. They did not carry bonds the way humans did. But each morning, his gaze lifted to the mountains anyway. One afternoon, as the snow finally began to recede from the highest slopes, Ethan stepped outside to breathe in the crisp, warming air. He leaned on his cane, letting the sun soak into his skin. The wind whispered through the pines. The world felt peaceful, calmer than it had in months. Then he saw it. A quiet shimmer of movement near the distant ridge. A shape, golden against the fading snow. Ethan squinted, heart pounding. The figure stood still, tall and unmistakable. Mara, her mane catching the afternoon light, her posture strong and steady. And beside her, two nearly grown cubs, healthy, tall, stretching their limbs like young royalty surveying a kingdom. Ethan felt his breath catch in his throat. He stood frozen, afraid to blink, afraid the vision might dissolve into sunlight. Mara remained motionless at first, watching him from afar. There was no fear in her stance, no urgency, just recognition, deep and clear. She took one slow step forward, then another, only to stop again at the ridge's edge. The cubs flanked her, their coats shimmering in the slanted light. Ethan lifted a hand, not waving, but acknowledging, quiet, respectful. The same way he had approached her that first night when the storm threatened to take everything. Mara's tail flicked once. She lowered her head slightly. An unmistakable gesture. A farewell. A blessing. A thank you. The weight of the moment struck Ethan so deeply that tears blurred his vision. He let them fall. He didn't wipe them away. The lioness turned her head toward her cubs, nudging them gently. Together, the three of them began to walk along the ridge, their silhouettes framed against the golden glow of the setting sun. Step by step, they moved toward the far side of the mountain, back to the wild world that had shaped them. At the ridge's crest, Mara paused one last time. She looked back at Ethan, her amber eyes catching the light. For a heartbeat, the world held still. No wind, no sound, nothing but the unbroken line of connection stretching between them. Then she disappeared beyond the peak, her cubs following close behind. The mountains swallowed their forms. leaving only the whisper of pine needles and the soft rush of the evening breeze. Ethan remained standing on his porch long after they were gone, hand still lifted at his side, heart impossibly full. Some bonds, he realized, weren't meant to be explained. They were meant to be felt. They were meant to change you. They were meant to last, even across wilderness, even across silence, even across worlds. And as the sun dipped behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, Ethan finally whispered the words he had carried in his chest since the day the storm brought them together. Thank you, Mara, for everything. For the first time in a very long time, the mountains felt gentle again. And Ethan Walker did not feel alone. Not anymore. If this story touched your heart, tell me with the simplest comment you can. Just drop a 0 or 1 below. I read every single one, and it truly keeps these stories alive. And if you want to walk with me through more unbelievable moments between humans and the wild, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next story waiting just beyond the tree line.